Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Dr. Sopao Ia, good morning to you. Good morning to, good evening to you, Dr. Sopao in California, and to Professor Wingrat, Netipo, and Dr. Tan Mindu. So I think we will have this is the first time we will have a connection from the US in our public forum. So before we start, let me invite the Dean, Professor Ek Tang Sapatana, to provide some welcome remarks, and then we'll go from there. Jan Ek.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you, and welcome to the ISIS Forum. I am pleased to kick off our last ISIS public forum for year 2020, and this has been a difficult pandemic year for all of us. As Thailand has been able to contain virus case infection, we are lucky to be able to hold this event in person with social distancing and hygienic guidelines. I would like to sincerely thank Friedrich Naumann Foundation for supporting our public forums, without which we would not be able to address key domestic and regional issues in an independent fashion. Today, our focus is on domestic politics. Among the 5 countries of mainland Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand, or CMT, hold multiparty elections periodically. In view of recent polls in Myanmar, Thailand in 2019, and Cambodia in 2018, we will focus on political outcomes and democratic prospects, as well as the foreign relations in these 3 countries. What is the state of democracy in CMT, and where are their economics headed amidst the coronavirus pandemics? What are the dynamics between government and opposition? Where has been the role of civil society, and are some of near-term political prospects as we enter 2021 and beyond? These are some of the questions we will look at this morning. In addition, we will be interested in the intersection between domestic politics and regional relations, and the role of major powers, especially China and the United States and European Union. As the US now has a new incoming administration under President Joe Biden, we will be watching the US-China geopolitical tensions and rivalry carefully. How the new US government engage with Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand will be consequential. I'm honored to introduce to you our panel experts, namely Dr. Sopao Ia, who is online with us here, Professor Wingrat Netipo, and Dr. Tan Min U. Their bios are available at the registration desk. Each is a foremost expert in their respective countries. This forum is also being live streamed on Facebook, and its video record will be available thereafter. And thanks to Kun David Foster and his giant tech team for this effort. There is much to think about and be concerned about these 3 countries. I hope you will enjoy the discussion. Many thanks for joining, and please accept my good wishes for the year-end season, and Happy New Year to all of you in advance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Ek. I'll just say a little bit about the genesis of this public forum. We have 3 countries, so C, Cambodia, of course, and then M, Myanmar, and T, Thailand. Laos and Vietnam are not included, even though they're in mainland Southeast Asia. because they don't have elections and kind of democracy that we have around here. Now, initially, I wanted to do Thai politics only, but that's hard to do without undue scrutiny. So then I learned that my old friend Tan Min was coming to town with his wife, Sophia. And so I said, hey, I have to have him speak here at Chula. So then I thought, we can do Thailand and Myanmar. Thailand and Myanmar, comparative perspective. But then I thought, we should do also Cambodia, because Cambodia also fits in the same category. So here we are. We have Cambodia, Myanmar and Thailand. The order of the sequence will be, I think, Cambodia first, and then we'll go to Thailand, and we'll go to Myanmar. Dr. Sopal, can you hear us okay there? And thank you for joining us at your hour. I think it's evening time. And we're here now in this room, but I hope you can see us maybe a little bit. And we have a very good tech team, so it's very interactive and instantaneous, more or less. Let me first invite a Cambodian perspective. So some of the themes we're looking at in Southeast Asia, the role of the youth movements. I think we're seeing that in Thailand, a lot of that in Thailand, but also in Cambodia to an extent, and the wider region. We had elections in Cambodia was July 2018, Myanmar recently, just last month, and then of course in Thailand we had it in March 2019 last year. But in each of these countries, the prospects are problematic a little bit. Since the election, Cambodia, I think, is a elected one-party state now. The role of the opposition, the CNRP, Cambodia National Rescue Party, the main opposition has been dissolved. So it was a kind of a one-party election. In Thailand, also opposition party dissolved after the election in March 2019, a major opposition party, the Future Forward Party. And then, of course, in Myanmar, we'll get to that. So Dr. Sopal, can you give us a little bit of a perspective? How should we be seeing Cambodia these days? Prime Minister Hun Sen, is the CNRP still viable? Will it come back? What's the near-term and longer-term prospects, horizon for Cambodia? Dr. Sopal.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Phongsidirak and Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As a professor, I tend to prepare slides, so I have a couple of slides just to set a bit of the context, and I'll try to share them with you now. Let's see, I hope. If not, I'll know about it at some point. You should say something about this. But I want to just basically set a little bit of the context, and I think you have already mentioned sort of the problems that have taken place. Democracy in Cambodia has really been in tatters since 2017, and not that it was great before 2017, but at least there was competition in elections. So in 1993, the first election in the sort of post-UNTAC period happened, and the Royalist Party won the plurality of the vote, but you had a two-prime minister setup. And in 2013, the election that did include the CNRP, the Cambodian National Rescue Party, saw that party win again quite a percentage of the vote, although it did not win the most votes in terms of percentage, but gave a good scare to the ruling Cambodian People's Party, and then I think triggered a lot of what you've seen since then in terms of the reaction by the ruling party. Just to remind everybody of what's happened in Cambodia in really the last 20 years, you have had what Cambodians call a broken spirit, baspat, a kind of murder of opposition union figures, environmental figures, political commentators, here shown Chiavichia, Chutwati, and Kemlay, 2004, 2012, 2016, and basically in succession. And it really does, I think, send a message to Cambodian democracy that, if you stick your head out, things are going to happen to you. Of course, this has been in contrast to what the Prime Minister of Cambodia has said, let us solve our problems here at the World Economic Forum, imploring others to not stick their fingers into Cambodia's politics. You've hinted at the fact that the one of the main opposition leaders, Sam Rainsy, has been essentially exiled. I mean, he can't get home. He got up to Malaysia and Indonesia, and then had to return to France. Meanwhile, the head of the opposition party, the president of the opposition party, Kem Sokha, was jailed for a year, was under house arrest, and then spent another year released, but can't really engage in politics and is still on trial. Meanwhile, one of the VPs of the opposition party also can't get back to Cambodia. In fact, she's trying right now to get a visa to enter Cambodia. After all, she's supposedly on trial for various crimes, and so she wants to attend her own trial. But instead, she's stuck in Rhode Island. She's a U.S. citizen as well as a Cambodian citizen. And the Cambodian authorities have been responding to these actions, or have taken their own stance, which is, to write white papers titled "To Tell the Truth," for example, March 2018, to expel the National Democratic Institute in August of 2017, as well as to cause Radio Free Asia's broadcast to be impeded by shuttering their local representation, and by closing out one of the two biggest independent dailies in Cambodia, the Cambodia Daily, in September 2017, under the pretense of tax evasion of some kind, and then forcing the sale of the Phnom Penh Post in May 2018. So the equivalent of the New York Times and the Washington Post essentially being out of the independent journalism business, and let's say the Post being taken over by the ruling party. And the Cambodian National Assembly, with the help of the Supreme Court of Cambodia, voting here in November 2017 to take all the seats of the Cambodian National Rescue Party after the dissolution of the Cambodian National Rescue Party by order of the Supreme Court of Cambodia. Of course, it's argued as something independent, but it's in fact something quite dependent and quite seen as really the demand of the ruling party materializing. So all the seats that were blue here becoming essentially being handed over at that point to the Royalist Party, which had won 3.66% of the popular vote. As you know, the elections of 2018 were essentially perfunctory insofar as the main opposition, Cambodian National Rescue Party, was not on the ballot. So the question really is what's going to happen in 2022 during the commune election, and in 2023 during the next general election. That's still a couple of years away. It's hard to predict whether there'll be a change in the current position of the ruling party, but we know that essentially the outcome of an election in 2018 where the main opposition party wasn't on the ballot was that the ruling Cambodian People's Party took all the seats, so 125 parliamentary seats as a result. And in terms of foreign relations, we have, you've hinted that there is certainly this proximity to China in terms of finances, in terms of politics, and we have seen the warning signs. So Daniel Coates, who was the Director of National Intelligence in January 2019, said that in the report to Congress, statement for the record, said Cambodia's slide towards autocracy, which culminated in the Cambodian People's Party's retention of power and complete dominance of the national legislature, opens the way for a constitutional amendment that could lead to a Chinese military presence in the country. And we have certainly seen that in the reporting that has taken place here from the South China Morning Post, where this Darasakor project in Khakhong province by this Chinese firm Union Development Group looks a bit suspicious insofar as it has the longest runway anywhere in Cambodia and a deep water port which could accommodate very large vessels. And so it's caused a lot of suspicion, and the reaction from the current administration at the White House has been to essentially condemn this, to use the global Magnitsky human rights accountability to essentially put on the list Union Development Group and others involved. And I think, you know, this is probably the right approach in terms of calling out certain actions. The European Union, at the same time, has caused 20% of Cambodia's exports to now be suspended from the everything but arms preferential trade agreement. So about €1 billion. And so there's that. There's the GLOMAG actions from the U.S. putting pressure on what appears to be still a blossoming relationship between Prime Minister Hun Sen and Xi Jinping. And I think the narrative that Cambodia wants to undertake has always been very much one that is consistent with Xi Jinping's perspective, because in 2009, while in Mexico, he, in a private meeting that leaked out, said that had a very, I think, important thought that he shared with the world. He didn't think he was sharing it with the world, but it became one that was shared with the world. And he said, there are few foreigners with full bellies who have nothing better to do than to try to point fingers at our country. China does not export revolution, hunger, poverty, nor does China cause you any headaches. Just what else do you want? And that export revolution is certainly something that Cambodia and the Cambodian government has used to kind of say, you know, these color revolutions is what the West has been trying to do to Cambodia. And so this is the export revolution argument that is consistent, I think, with Xi Jinping thought in terms of saying that, you know, we're victims like you are of this Western cabal that is pushing for a color revolution. Where is Cambodia heading? Certainly not in the place that I'd hoped for. A lot of prisoners currently and people on trial, mass trials happening. So there are young activists, exactly the kind of youth that really are needed for the future of Cambodia, who have been advocating for environmental responsibility and other things, who have ended up in prison. There's currently 121, possibly 130 opposition figures, not necessarily CNRP members, who are in a mass trial. They didn't receive per se a subpoena that had their name on it, but they were given this, and so they've shown up in court. And of course, the first thing that happened was, you know, they said it's going to be delayed until January, but it's hanging over them, which is obviously the kind of stuff that happens in Iran, the kind of stuff that happened in the Soviet Union, mass trials, show trials, and trials in absentia. And so we're in a tough spot in Cambodia, I think. Part of the argument can be seen in these white papers that the authorities have written, and one of the preambles of which has a quote by Hun Sen, who says, "Real democracy in Cambodia has not been set back or fallen. Instead, it has been protected and strengthened in accordance with the principle of the rule of law for the great benefit of the people and nation. Only fake democracy has been abolished." I think this was at the apex of his being inspired by President Trump at some point, but the use of this language is quite consistent with that. But I'll end with that, and I know there'll be lots of questions later, but I hope you enjoyed these few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sopao. Let me ask you to broaden this a little bit, if you could. With the new Biden administration, do you think things will be different? Will there be more pressure from the U.S., or can anything else be done to undo or unwind this autocratic rule?
I lost the last bit of your question there, but I will say that you asked about whether with the new Biden administration there's going to be an undoing of that, and I certainly expect that there would be, because you know, the emphasis so far has been on China and Cambodia, and how China's involvement in Cambodia is completely unacceptable to the U.S. I expect that message not to disappear, but to certainly be bolstered by the argument that democracy now matters again to the United States, and it isn't just a kind of a tool to be used at a moment where it's convenient to use it, but that certainly in Cambodia, a return to an expectation that democracy be, what the West has invested in Cambodia since 1993 with its billions of dollars, and a return on investment on that would be desired. So I think that there's likely to be a demand for that from the Biden administration, and saying that, Phnom Penh needs to return to the path of democracy, and not just talking about China as a kind of issue that is constantly brought up currently.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to you, Dr. Sopao. It's a very discouraging and depressing situation that you have depicted. Let me move a little bit to Thailand now. There are similar shades of comparisons to Cambodia. We've had elections, but part of the opposition has been dissolved and regrouped. There's also been a lot of dissent. Unlike Cambodia, Thailand does have dissent in the streets now. We're seeing a big youth movement. Over the last 2 decades, Professor Wingrat, we've gone around in circles of having election in 2001, 2005, and then military coup in 2006. And then the election in 2007, 2011, military coup in 2014, and then now election in 2019. Why are we going in circles? And do you think that this round of dissent by these younger people, younger generation, is any different than before?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Thitinan. That's what I was thinking the whole time listening to Cambodian politics. Very depressing and relate a lot to Thailand. Thank you once again for inviting me, and good morning for everyone. It's good to be here. I have been a big fan of ISIS Forum, and now I'm here. I'm so excited, and thank you for this opportunity. I have been observing the provincial politics, so my views probably would go further than Bangkok, outside Bangkok. And I have been observing the linkage between politicians and voters at the local level, grassroots level. But that's my strength, my expertise that I would like to share here. And recently, as Deputy Dean of Student Affairs, my role is involving in students, so I have to adjust and learning about the students. So I became a very close observer with this protest. So I would like to begin my analysis to the current situation of the protest, and then I will go further to tell you what are the causes of this, I would call it dead end of Thai politics. And it is different from what we experienced in the past several decades of the contemporary Thai politics that led to this dead end, I would say. I often half jokingly, half seriously told my friends outside Thailand that when they asked me what it was like in Thailand, I often said, oh, the mood is like 18th century France, or maybe perhaps pre-revolution in Russia in early 20th century. But the technology, the economy, the media, communication is exactly 21st century. And the idea floating around the young generation exactly represent what global idea is going on. So this is quite unpredictable as well as quite dangerous as an observer myself. Firstly, the situation, I think the situation, look at the content inside the protest, it reveals the frustration of the young generation. So in two folds, I would like to analyze in two folds. First, the frustration of authoritarian regime. Authoritarianism, not only in the regime, but also in everyday life, especially in the education system, particularly imposed since 2014 after the latest coup. It came in the form of uniform, haircut, the way they have to cite what their duties are, and they have to write essays on a lot of things related to state ideology. And that kind of thing, for the students, they consider it as very oppressive society, once you walk into Thai school, you could really feel the oppression inside the education. Further than that, not only the everyday life, they had a chance to vote. Early last year, their votes were dismissed in the form of party dissolution, in the form of banning a lot of politicians, especially opposition leaders. And one of my students said, all of these were quite bearable until the COVID hit Thailand and locked them in with loyalist family, with oppressive family, and they had no chance to sneak out to have some kind of cool photos to share on social media. That even worse, and that situation became unbearable. So this is quite striking for me that they said they could bear with it, And the second frustration is that these kids, this student, the age of 14 to 22, who are leaders, obviously the participants were, a lot of them are 24 to 35, according to the immediate survey at the spot, like put a sticker that how old you are, and then most of the majority, like more than half of them, are those who just start working. But the leaders are all 14 to 20. And what are they sharing in this generation? I think they share frustration of having no relation with the monarchy. 5 years is long enough for them, and the monarchy is the most important institution of Thai politics and society. But they have no relation. It was like imposing a different religion, an irrelevant religion in the minds of totally different believers, although they don't know what they're believing. But the dominant ideology, which imposed by schools, public administration, media, and everything, are quite alienating them away from the image floating around in Thai society. So in our generation, we look back the society in terms of decades. Half a century is like a history, but for them, 5 years, like the whole life. So the frustration came out and burst out into the form of protest without knowing what idea they have or what a kind of destination they are going. But day by day, they form their shared ideology, they shared hope, and they share their dream of a better society. But I think they came out for these two aspects of frustration. I would like to go in the secondly, I would like to analyze this current situation by terming it as the dead end of Thai politics by looking into two forms. The first form is the process of deinstitutionalization, political deinstitutionalization, or the process of undermining political institutions, especially democratic institutions. The second one is a form of nationalism, nationhood, and Thainess, or whatsoever. The first deinstitutionalization, since 2006, the movement, people's movement, as well as the authority movement, just started to prevent corruption. One man to be out of politics and supported by elite and urban middle class. It began with eliminating corruption, gradually eliminating one man, gradually eliminating his party, many parties that follow, and eventually, as I observed closely at the provincial level, the authorities trying to eliminate the network between politicians and voters, which for me I think is the last resort of political institution or the strength of political party. So the purpose of the coup in 2014 just to finish the unfinished project that started in 2006. And along this line, I would like to emphasize that the election that held last year in 2019 was a very big event to further the institutionalization of politics. through the election. So it's, it's quite ironic because, we had election in order to develop the democracy, restore the democracy, but in fact this election deinstitutionalized the politics further, particularly the draft of the constitution that allowed 250 senators to vote for the prime minister, and that's who were appointed electoral system that distort the voters' views, the organic laws that do not support party organization, and the calculation of the seats in the parliament was quite odd, according to several people, and resulting in totally disaster, and resulting in so many parties in the parliament that in a way weaken one of the very important institutions, the parliament. And we were hoping that the independent organizations such as Election Commission, Constitutional Court to act as independent organization, but actually it's really lost trust from people. And I think I could see that the junta government, that they occupy Thai politics for 5 years, tried to do their best at the grassroots level to cut loose the linkage between especially Pheu Thai party or former opposition party with voters in northern Thailand and northeastern Thailand. And I think this is the one important dimension that sadly is the last resort, and it was weakening by co-optation as well as hijack the network and co-optation, as you see right before the election. Like I witnessed a lot of former MPs try their best to connect with people, like visiting village every day, attending funerals, attending the weddings party, and at the end they offer or they force something that Pheu Thai MP couldn't say no by the Palang Pracharat, the junta supported party, to force them to join or to invite them to join to encourage or whatever the way, but yeah, with their linkage they had before. So you can't really have healthy political regimes with these fallen institutions, and I think we are facing the dead end because we have no functional institutions. On 18 November, when the parliament rejected against the proposal to amend the constitution, that's the last hope for me, and a lot of my colleagues were hoping that at least parliament, although not really full democratic, could be a venue for negotiating or to ease the crisis. And the second, I would like to think this dead end is caused by, I used a very extreme word, but it's likely to be that way, the collapse of the Thai national ideology, which has the monarchy of the top of this ideology, very important. And on the footnote, I would like to say that partly this young generation's protest is like a way to come out to seek new nationalism, new national ideology. And I don't think they are, I think they have a direction to go, but still, on the way, kind of contesting. And as you witness, sometimes, they brought to a very further away or shift away from the main ideology or from what they are forming and then fall apart or whatever. As we witness, like would I to footnote a little bit more further that part of them, went to socialism, communism. This is how, a lack of national ideology would lead young generation to. That's to be worrisome for a lot of people, or to be, looking forward to with a few people, but quite radical. So the young generation has no relation with this ideology, and they're seeking a new ideology. While the old generation who have given their heart and belief and faith to the king, the late king, not the institution, still cling on the old good image, and started to have difficulty in holding on this national ideology. So the current deadlock of the failure of institutions that I said before has close relation with this failure of the national ideology. It's this the protest and this deadlock of institutions. For me, it made me review back to the old days, and in like 1973, 1976, 1992, every time we had crisis, we placed our trust, our belief, our faith to the late king, not in the monarchy as institution, but as the figure, as our king who would have a decision and find a way out for us. So what now? That I would like to end my the first round of talk by giving you the image and imagination of the deadlock for these two folds, which is quite leading to an unpredictable situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we will be keen to hear beyond, if you continue, what would the conversation be like? So deadlock and dead end, a bit of a stalemate. But I think the point about the national identity is really the key. So if you reject, I think that the Thai identity as such is being rejected. All the symbolisms, all the institutions. At the same time, there's been a systematic weakening of democratic institutions, right? Parliament, constitutions, political parties, politicians, political parties have been dissolved repeatedly. At the same time, the old institutions, the traditional institutions with that old identity of the Thainess and Thai national identity is being rejected by the younger generations, like in Cambodia too, Dr. Sopao, that maybe the younger generations, they have a different way of seeing the world. They're not so attached to the previous era from the Cold War. So similar in Thailand, but your point is very good that there's no alternative that they have come up with. That's why sometimes they go astray, they talk about socialism, communism, and I think also the younger generations, maybe they're learning by doing, they're exploring. So if you don't take the traditional Thai national identity, then what identity do you take? And it's almost like a new identity formation that we are going through. So thank you very much, and we'll be very eager to hear from you beyond your last remarks about the deadlock and the dead end. Now I come to Myanmar, Dr. Tan Miru. His latest book is outside, available for sale, Hidden History of Burma. He's got some previous books as well, including the one I like the most. I haven't finished this one yet, but the River of Lost Footsteps, I like that a lot. And of course, Tan, this is a very familiar neighborhood. You have a home in Bangkok. You were with Aung in Cambodia in 1993. Myanmar just had elections last month, and it's very depressing for me to say that Myanmar is ahead of Thailand. The constitution, 25% quota military. Thai constitution, 33% quota. And Myanmar has had regular elections. I mean, whatever the performance of the government, they had election 5 years ago, they had election again, and they will have election in 5 years. And this is the same way since 1993 for Cambodia. In Thailand, we have to wait for elections, and it can be a long wait, and it seems like the timing depends, it's up to the authorities. But with the most recent elections, Thant, please give us a bit of a outlook on the current challenges, the daunting path ahead, and NLD won big again. Did that surprise you? And what are some of the missing gaps here, maybe in the Shan State, Rakhine, and so on? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and really a pleasure to be here in Bangkok. I think this is the first sort of live talk that I've done in almost a year. I've been in Yangon most of the time since the pandemic began in March. I'll assure all of you I didn't walk across the border from Tachi Lake to Mae Sai. I flew in and went through quarantine. As Kun Thitinan said as well, it's very interesting to hear what's happened in Cambodia. I lived there in 1992, 1993, working for UNTAC. Actually, it was my very first job, and I worked also as a polling officer in the elections at that time. I was 26 then, so I'm not sure I was doing the right thing, but at least I had that experience. And that was the time, 1992, 1993, when I wasn't actually allowed to go back to Myanmar. In 88, we had had the uprising. I had sided with the dissidents and the students, many of whom came to Thailand or to the Thai border, and I wasn't allowed to go back until 1996, and even then in quite strictly controlled conditions in terms of who I could see. And when we moved here, my wife and I, to Bangkok in 2008, 2009, I started going back to Myanmar more regularly. And as you'll remember, that was a time of sort of the dark days of the Myanmar military dictatorship. There had been the uprising in 2007 led by Buddhist monks that had been put down. We had Cyclone Nargis, which killed 140,000 people in one night, and aid to the survivors was very difficult to organize in the aftermath. And if you had said to me in 2010, would we have 3 elections, at least 2 of which would be relatively free and fair, and would we see in 10 years Aung San Suu Kyi as the leader of the country winning a second landslide election, I would have been more than extremely skeptical. I was one of the very few people at that time in 2010 who thought that maybe there would be some change around the corner, that maybe this new constitution, which is not a democratic constitution, a hybrid constitution where the military still holds quite a lot of power and authority, that it would still lead to some kind of change. And many people didn't think that that would happen at all. But it would have been beyond my wildest dreams to see the kind of situation we have now. So I think if we look at things from the prism of a quarter-century-long ambition by many people in Myanmar for some kind of progress towards democracy, that story hasn't been too bad so far. And what we've seen now with the second election is lots of technical problems perhaps, but still a relatively, especially by regional standards, relatively free and fair election. It wasn't as free and fair as it could have been because of a number of different factors. For example, at least 1 million people, perhaps a couple of million people were disenfranchised because voting was cancelled in many constituencies that were close to or in areas of armed conflict. We have the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh who have not been allowed to vote in any election since the beginning of the decade. We see many migrant workers in Thailand who, of course, cannot vote in these elections. We've seen, because of the pandemic, a lot of restrictions on what could have happened in terms of the election campaign itself, which really privileged the incumbent party. And Aung San Suu Kyi, for the first time, took to Facebook in the spring at the start of the pandemic. She's built up an enormous following on social media, as she has in real life as well. And this also gave her an enormous advantage, whereas many of the smaller political parties and ethnic political parties had difficulty mobilizing at all. There were severe restrictions on meeting in person. And of course, people couldn't move from place to place as well as they would have wanted in the approach to the election. So in some ways, it wasn't fair. In some ways, the results may have been different if it had been in a non-COVID environment, if people hadn't been disenfranchised in ethnic minority areas especially. But the general outcome, I think, would have been the same. And if, to the extent that I think it's the majority of people who genuinely wanted Aung San Suu Kyi to lead the country for another 5 years, that is the outcome. And in that way, the election results reflect the will of the majority of people. And if that is what democracy is primarily about, reflecting the will of the majority, then I think we're on track in some ways towards seeing that kind of government. The problem is that Myanmar, since independence, a big problem in Myanmar has been majority rule. Because Myanmar is a society which has been deeply divided on ethnic grounds, where the Myanmar or Burmese-speaking Buddhist majority is 2/3 or so of the population, where there are many different identities, ethnic identities, different languages and religions, and where, in a way, I mean, this is one way of thinking about it, if democracy is, again, at its core about majority rule, how does that connect to the problem in Myanmar that majority rule has also been a big problem throughout its recent and modern history? Of course, if we kind of zoom out from the elections and maybe just to say one final word on the political context right now. So we have had elections. Aung San Suu Kyi is, in a way, at the peak of her political power. She's now 75. She'll be 76 over the coming year. Under this constitution, she cannot be president because her her kids are foreign citizens, but she will choose the president. The NLD landslide means that despite the military's 25% of seats in parliament, that the NLD will have the ability basically to choose whoever they want to be president, and that president in turn will choose the chief ministers of the different states and regions, as well as union ministers, deputy ministers, the entire government lineup. So it's hers to choose, but it is still a cohabitation in a way, because the army commander-in-chief can choose a vice president and 3 still quite powerful ministers. He himself is going to turn 65 in the summer and is scheduled to retire, but it's not completely clear that he will. And so the central dynamic in Myanmar politics right now is between the relationship between Aung San Suu Kyi and the commander-in-chief and what they might want and where they might be in 6 months or a year's time. And that still has to play out. I think once that plays out over the coming weeks, we will see the NLD then choose the government lineup. Parliament will convene, and it's a long process. It's not until April, actually, that we'll actually see the new government in place, where we might see some new faces, but many old faces as well. But, you know, as I mentioned before, if we zoom out, we see a very different picture. So that central picture is not so bad compared to where we were 10 years ago. The country is far freer despite many problems than it's been really since half a century, since before the army first took over in 1962. But we see this whole host of other challenges. The most obvious, especially from the outside, has been the Rohingya violence and the expulsion of many hundreds of thousands of people in 2016 and 2017, where there's really almost, I would say right now, very little hope or no hope of their return to the country in the foreseeable future. We still have enormous problems facing Muslim communities that are left in Rakhine State. But what's much less known outside is that in Rakhine State now we also have a new insurrection or revolt against the government. We have the Arakan Army, which was formed 10 years ago, which has gone from a few hundred men to several thousand extremely well-trained men. They have taken over certain areas in Rakhine State, or formerly Arakan. Their goal is what they call the Arakan Dream 2020, where they want complete self-determination for their area, which used to be an independent kingdom. And this is by far the most important insurrection against the central government in a generation at least. And this is at a time when armed conflicts are still exist in other parts of the country. We're, I think many of you know, in Myanmar in the northeast and along the Thai border as well as the Chinese border, we have over 20 different ethnic armed organizations as well as hundreds of militia. And this is not a civil war in the sense that this is an area that's suddenly fractured in the last 5, 10, 15 years. This is an area that's never been controlled by any central government. This is a frontier area primarily between China and Myanmar, where the peoples in these areas, again, have never come under central authority, have different identities, different languages, different religions to some extent as well, which has always been this gray area between Myanmar and China, and which has also become the home over the past many decades of multi-billion-dollar illicit economies, like the production of methamphetamines, which the UNODC estimates is worth being over $70 billion a year. There are many other challenges in Myanmar. We have the pandemic, we have climate change, we have China next door. And I would put that as a central challenge for Myanmar, not necessarily because of what's often in the news about China encouraging Myanmar to accept BRI, massive kind of infrastructure projects, but simply because of China's success relative to Myanmar's economic failure over the past generation, which means that China, which 20, 30, 40 years ago was maybe the same in terms of per capita GDP, or maybe double by 1990, is now 10, 20, 30 times richer. And that itself, having a China which just recently had landed a spacecraft on the moon and is moving ahead in 5G technology and artificial intelligence and everything else, just having a China next to Myanmar with this open border that is so much richer, so much more technologically advanced, is an enormous challenge for Myanmar going ahead. Maybe one final set of points to think about in terms of the challenges is the political economy of the country. And I think if we think about the future of democracy, perhaps in Cambodia and in Thailand as well, we really have to think about the political economy of the country. Who owns Myanmar? Who is making money in Myanmar? For what reasons? How will these things change, or how are these things changing in some way? Many people think of the story of Myanmar as a story of dictatorship and then the struggle for democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD and everything else. But a different story, which I think is actually a much more, in some ways, the story that has affected the lives of many more people in a much more direct way, is this political economy story. Myanmar was under the British until 1948. It was a very exploitative economy under the colonial regime. And because of that, Myanmar governments in 1948 turned to the left. And so every Myanmar government from 1948 to 1988 called itself socialist. It was either under a democratic government or under a military government, but they all said that they were socialist, and they moved towards nationalization, land redistribution, and everything else. And the main opposition was communist, so even further to the left, the communist insurgents and the underground and everything else. All of that collapsed in 1988, and the Myanmar army, under a new junta, established a new capitalist system. But it became a very corrupt capitalist system, a very cronyistic capitalist system. It became a capitalist system that was intimately tied to the drug trade, at least in the beginning. It was very much tied to China's industrial revolution in Yunnan as well as elsewhere. It was very much tied to this country in terms of Thai labor markets needing millions of unskilled Myanmar workers to fill positions that couldn't be filled otherwise. And it created an incredibly unequal society as well. Right now, and I'll end here because I know we want to have time for questions and things, I think Myanmar is at this real inflection point because Aung San Suu Kyi, in a way, has power. The army does have power. The army still has a lot of authority, as I mentioned, but she has this incredible popular mandate right now. And she won not only in Burmese-speaking Buddhist areas, but she won in many ethnic minority areas as well, in a very definitive way. She can appoint who she wants. Even though the military has certain cabinet positions, she controls what is about a $25 billion budget. She controls health, education, economic policy, foreign investment, all of these other things, the judicial system as well. And with COVID crisis, we've had the lockdown, the whole world has faced enormous economic problems. Myanmar has faced extremely severe, almost catastrophic economic problems because of the pandemic. The three big drivers of the Myanmar economy over the past 5-10 years has been the expansion of trade with China, and especially the export of primary commodities to Chinese markets, has been the growth of a garment sector industry, which now employs about 1.5 million people, mostly for export to Europe, and then remittance economy from Thailand especially, which is worth $3 to $4 billion a year. That's not counting the illicit economies as well. These have been the drivers. All of those have been hit incredibly hard by the pandemic. A recent study that was done suggested that poverty in Myanmar, so people making below $1.9 a day, has risen from 16% of the population in January to 63% of the population in October. It's an enormous knock. But the question is, how will Myanmar come out of this pandemic? Will it go back to the same old industries? Can it change? And I think the real challenge for Myanmar is not so much going back to the way it was before, simply relying on cheap labor coming to Thailand, simply relying on agricultural exports to China, but can it really power development in a new direction in a much more dynamic way? Because it cannot afford not to. A Myanmar that remains, even if poverty goes down, a Myanmar that remains underdeveloped, that is simply exporting cheap labor and primary commodities, will fall further and further behind China. It will fall further and further behind many other countries in the region. And that, I think, will undermine any prospects for democracy being sustainable. It will create a more unequal society, an increasingly unequal society. It will not be a society that has the tens of billions of dollars necessary to confront climate change, for example, as well as future pandemics or other challenges. Whereas the right kind of development model, the right kind of not just inclusive development, but really dynamic development, if done correctly and linked to a project of a new national identity and a project of thinking about what the vision of the country can be in 10, 20 years' time, I think that is the thing that has the potential of uniting people across different ethnic groups as well. And so I think that is the conversation that's been missing, and hopefully we can have that conversation over the coming year. So let me end with that.
Thank you, Tan. Let me pick up on a couple of themes that came out of your remarks. First, do you think that this civil-military compromise essentially will hold in the longer term? I mean, and then in the longer term, beyond Aung San Suu Kyi, who is she preparing, or what's the new generation going to be like in leadership? And then the insurrection you mentioned, we have insurrection in all three countries, but in different ways. But in Myanmar, more ethnic based. Has that become intractable now a little bit?
Yeah, I guess the first thing is, this political stage that the army set up, this hybrid model of the army having seats in parliament and everything else, this is not something that they came up with all of a sudden in 2010. This is something that the army had been carefully crafting and developing as an idea since the early 1990s. This is what they wanted in the early 1990s. In the mid-1990s, it was actually the Americans, Madeleine Albright and others, who said, this is unacceptable, it's not real democracy. That also convinced Aung San Suu Kyi and others to resist that. So this is a stage that was carefully set by the army. But in the early 90s, some of the ex-generals who were in power went beyond that script, right? They liberalized, they freed up the media, they released political prisoners, and all of that convinced both people inside and outside that maybe this is actually a first step towards real democracy, real liberal democracy in some way. But I think changing the constitution, we're still far from it. This is what the NLD hopes for, and this is what Aung San Suu Kyi hopes for. But I think for the army, it's not so much having their cake and eating it too, but this is something that they've wanted for such a long time that I think they will, and in a way it's worked. I mean, it's provided a degree of stability. So I think we're at the very least 5, if not 10, 15 years away from that changing. I think in a post-Aung San Suu Kyi world, it's very difficult because even though the NLD has won this convincing victory, so much depends on her as one person. And it's very hard to see, if you look at the history of Myanmar politics, there not being a much more fractured political landscape after her, where you could imagine a landscape where this constitution holds, where there's maybe 50 or 100 political figures who are equal, but of much less weight and political weight and capital than Aung San Suu Kyi, with the army still being, if not a dominant, then a key institution on the side. I think that's kind of a default setup, but again, it depends a lot on where the political economy goes, and it depends a lot on where the ethnic conflict and issues of ethnicity go. I think with what we have to admit is that over the last 10 years, despite the peace process, despite negotiations, everything else, in some ways, ethnic conflict has gotten worse. I mean, the Rohingya expulsion is the most obvious example in some way, but this Rakhine insurrection is also, in some ways, equally important in terms of the future of the country. But that's tied to so many other factors, and it's also tied to the future of the bilateral relationship with China as well. So many different problems, and one wants to be optimistic, but I think at the same time we have to see that the capacity, because the country's been isolated for so long, the capacity of institutions in the country is very limited. So to be able to cope with all of these things, I think we need some fuel to power that change, and I think that has to be, again, a certain type of economic development.
Okay, thank you very much, Tant. I mean, this compromise and essentially power sharing, we're not seeing in Cambodia and Thailand. Dr. Sopal, thank you very much for being so patient, sitting there, by yourself while we're over here in the same room. Thank you very much. Let me just broaden, expand on this issue about power monopoly, and power sharing. There was some power sharing before in Cambodia, but I think in recent years we've seen a kind of a one-side takeover, and that's also linked to the China factor that you talked about, discussed before. And so Cambodia is all in on China. It's been demonstrated to the extent that when Cambodia chaired ASEAN in 2012, Cambodia obliged, I think, to the Chinese intentions of on the South China Sea. Therefore, the ASEAN was not able to come out with a joint statement for the first time. And Cambodia is still all in on China. Do you think this will change at all? And then, like Aung San Suu Kyi, and also like the Thailand leadership, what's the succession plan for Hun Sen? Who's going to come up? His son, the dynastic rule? Dr. Sopal.
Right. Well, on that second part of your question, actually, there's speculation, or there was a statement made recently by Hun Sen that Onporn Moniroth, the Minister of Economy and Finance, might be in the running for replacement as future Prime Minister. Perhaps a Goh Chok Tong model where you put in somebody who isn't your son for a number of years, and then your son can become prime minister after that. I'm not sure that that's, it was thrown floated as a trial balloon. It's a possibility. Of course, that assumes continued rule by the Cambodian People's Party, that there would not be any compromise with the opposition. As to your first question with respect to China, I think it's if there were a change in government, if there were a change in who rules Cambodia, there would certainly be a difference in posture with respect to China. I think that as long as the Cambodian People's Party remains in power, they've essentially made some kind of deal with China to kind of have each other's back. So Beijing is essentially funneling money to Cambodia and to the Cambodian People's Party with whether it's BRI projects and other activities, investments, and so on that are able to sustain and help the ruling party use some of these resources in electoral pursuits. So if there's an irrigation project that's 50, 100, 150 million dollars, the actual irrigation activity doesn't come anywhere close to that. Where is the rest of the money going? Well, it typically goes to electoral vote buying and other activities that the ruling party is engaged in. And so that mechanism, I think, is helping to sustain the ruling party's grip on power, whether the opposition party is part of the ballot or not. But now with the confidence of believing that essentially nothing can stop them, the ruling party has taken on a path that is very different from the one it held for almost 25 years, which was, yes, we would have an election, there would be opposition, there would be competitive elections in the sense of there would be an opposition party there, but from 2018 onwards, the script was flipped, and as you could see from my presentation, things have changed. They've decided that there won't be the Cambodian National Rescue Party, and I think they saw from polling data that the Cambodian National Rescue Party was becoming an increasingly viable alternative to their rule, and so the decision was made to somehow remove them from the equation. I think they used an Israeli pollster who ran the numbers and did the polling and group queries that essentially resulted in the decision that it's just better this way. And so for some reason, with China's help, they've been able to afford and sustain this path. So I'm afraid that as long as that continues, there doesn't seem to be an opportunity for change unless, of course, something dramatically happens where they allow Musa Kua, for example, the vice president of CNRP, to return to Cambodia, Sam Rainsy to return to Cambodia and resuscitate, whether it's called CNRP or some other name, to resuscitate a kind of true opposition party and not, the 19 opposition parties that they allowed on the ballot that were not actually opposition parties.
Okay, thank you. So the prospects on that a bit bleak, it seems. But this means there's a one side, kind of a complete takeover by the CPP and Hun Sen indefinitely. So that's going all the way. So Cambodia has really gone far, all the way, to eliminate the opposition officially, and then to side fully all in on China, and then just to have a kind of elected dictatorship. I'm going to ask follow up with Professor Wingrat, and after that I will open the floor to questions and comments. So please, if you have any, you can prepare them. Ajahn Wingrat, continuing from your remarks and presentation, so in Thailand, there's a different kind of insurrection. There's an insurrection rebellion now by the younger generations, and then the Thai incumbent regime, the military since the coup in 2014, has moved closer to China. Now there's a new administration in Washington. In fact, I think that a lot of people around here in Thailand on the one side will miss the Trump administration, because the Trump administration never really talked about human rights and democracy in elections. But I think the Biden administration will be different. Do you think this will force if the Biden administration becomes a bit more vocal on human rights and democracy, would this force the incumbent regime in Thailand to move even closer to China? That's my one question. Another one is, there's been a lot of talk about compromise. In Myanmar, there's a compromise. In Cambodia, no longer a compromise. In Thailand, one compromise modality would have been to not dissolve the Future Forward Party, for the incumbent regime to put up with the Future Forward Party in parliament. But with the dissolution of that party, sparking this mob, flash mobs and protest movement, and then continuing down the road through the year with more suppression, and now with the legal persecution and legal cases on the article, the section 112 against the protest leaders. So it looks like there's no compromise. At the same time, you mentioned dead end. I know I'm throwing a lot in here. What do you see beyond dead end? Closer to China, no compromise, complete takeover. You think that Thailand will go as far as Cambodia has gone?
Okay. Thank you, Ajahn Titinan. Well, you should know better about US and China. But I think Thai people, especially the political participants, they are quite inward-looking compared to, these two countries or other countries in Asia. I think Thai political actors are more inward-looking, except for some elites or some big business. But I think even students who are aware of this, when they they set their agenda, they don't very expect, the foreign factors in their movement, which is too bad, too sad, about that. But yeah, I think we're gonna see some move for pressure from the US as well as moving closer to China. And we have some kind of milk tea alliance in the young generation protest, as they support, previously they supported Taiwan and Hong Kong, and because of one drama that occurred in Twitter, and the young generation joined together in ASEAN, especially Thailand, to join with Taiwan and Hong Kong to oppose China. So the sentiment inside the protest is quite anti-China, anti-one China, I would say that. But I don't think this is a majority or dominant thinking among the young generation, or I could say that they don't really aware of this. They are not really concerned about this that much. And compromise, this is the good question, as I frame my talk on dead end. So I'm supposed to say no way out. I'm supposed to say no compromise. And it's very interesting when you see what to propose in this very polarized society. When you propose something, it means you propose for one side, but the other side wouldn't agree with this proposal. Therefore, it's very hard to see the way out. And I think the authority, the incumbent politicians already paved the way for no negotiation. And also the monarchy already, signal the side that not willing to compromise. So this is quite difficult position to go ahead, to go forward. But I think come back to see the institutional aspect, and what has left from democratization period, what have left from decentralization period. Sadly, it's not much, but we can see, especially at the local level. I think we should really keep hope on the local election, not really for PAO, which is taking place in this coming weekend, because PAO has their jurisdiction is not as close as to people as municipalities and TAO, Tambon Administrative Organizations. So they are really vulnerable to be co-opted and vulnerable to be kind of brokers for national politicians. So I press my hope to the next local election, and I think we should really pay attention to the local democracy, especially at the municipal level, to still keep local democracy alive as a last resort of political institutions, democratic institutions, and that have a very close linkage with voters. From my experience, I observed during the pandemic, and we study a few cities. I myself study Chiang Mai, and some people study a few urban municipalities, and we found a very high capacity of municipalities in managing the pandemic. Despite we are in the national level, we only saw the CCSA, the COVID centers, role in controlling information, and we could only see the capacity of Ministry of Public Health, which I admit they have very high capacity in manage the pandemic. But in fact, at the local level, at the network of community level, healthcare volunteers as well as municipal personnel, they work closely to prevent a spreading cluster from our urban area. And I think they had done quite impressively with the endorsement of some laws, especially a Communicable Disease Control Act that allow different agencies of the government to act independently. And that's quite a positive. So, and I think the bureaucracy in Thailand, though always support whatever, whoever become the government, and tend to be more conservative, tend to be more pro-state ideology, but I think still function. So the bureaucracy is still functioning. If we use the bureaucracy to move forward to more democratic politics, that would be a great idea, but how is quite difficult. So it depends on, I think, the power that shared by top elite. And I think for civil society, we haven't talked much about civil society, why our political scientists pay more attention to social movement. And I think I would plead this young generation to organize and to establish as institutional civil society. And it's more vulnerable to be, oppressed, but in a way it's prolong their move for a long run, and it also will empower them to have a say in public policy in the future, just like in Taiwan, in Korea, and in Japan sometimes. The social movement should really influence the public policy, but I don't see this movement would care for public policy in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. The floor is open. Also, the social media channels are also open for questions and remarks. I'll just highlight two points here that Dr. Thanminu brought up on the political economy as a driver of change. The young peoples, this is two generations born after 1980, Gen Y, Gen Z. The essential, if you look at their remarks and what they raging about is taxation, how taxes are being used, and representation, how they're not being represented. It's a flawed representation. So this is a major qualm, there's major grievance for them. And the other thing is the technology that's been empowering, is enable them to organize in their own way. And technology, and here we're talking about social media, platforms, and it's become a new classroom, new university for these young people. And we overlook it, but over the last decade, maybe even more, there've been a lot of information, and these younger generations have been reading and learning on their own. Sometimes people are surprised why they're doing this and who's backing them. Well, if you look at the social media, especially Twitter, you can see why they're getting the ideas, they're getting the conversations, their empowerment is coming from. I think I see a hand by our former foreign minister, Ambassador Kasit Pirom. Anyone else? And let's see.
ขอบคุณฮะ Thank you very much to all the panelists and for this invitation from ISIS. I'm on the board of
ท่านทูต microphone closer please.
I'm on the board of ASEAN Parliamentarian for Human Rights, and I'm also ICC Senior Fellow. I have one question each to the three panelists. The first one on Cambodia. Since Hun Sen is already in the Chinese camp, and now with Joe Biden and the U.S. administration, could there be a more concerted effort to be led by the United States and together with, I think, Japan, South Korea in particular, or Australia to a certain extent, to exert more pressure on Hun Sen to return democracy to Cambodia? That's the first question. Second one on Myanmar, with the overwhelming victory of Aung San Suu Kyi, would that give her the strength to challenge the military establishment and push further on the national reconciliation and I think the nation state building inclusive of the, I think, legacy, the citizenship for the Rohingyas? And third, on Thailand, I think the military establishment of Thailand is happy with the present constitution. They want to continue to be in politics. So the fight is not only for the young generation to ask for more democracy, but I think it's for the whole of the Thai society to get rid of the military from politics. I think that's the crux of the matter. Thank you.
Okay, a question for each speaker. Dr. Sopal, the new incoming Biden administration, what kind of differences we will see from Washington?
Right, and it's great to see you again, Excellency. It's been such a long time since we had dinner. I think that in terms of the hope that folks have about the Biden administration and creating a more concerted approach, more, say, multilateral as opposed to unilateral approach, are warranted. I mean, I think President-elect Biden does see action involving other countries as an important, as representing more of the approach that his administration would take, and certainly move away from the sort of Trump approach of, demanding that things go America first in America's way. And there's likely to be, I think, more perhaps finessing of partners and corralling of partners in that sense. So Japan has a lot of influence in Cambodia. Japan is seen certainly I see Singapore's surveys each year as really the only, the one power that does seem to be trustworthy, that doesn't have the baggage of China nor of the U.S., certainly under Trump. And so the hope would be to certainly use Japan in that way. Oddly enough, the places that have that see China as most dangerous or sort of as antithesis to their principles, whether it's Taiwan or Hong Kong, seem to be afraid that Biden might be a little too soft on China, and so I certainly hope that's not going to be the case, because that would be the opposite. That would be to essentially placate and allow perhaps more of what China wants to do in Cambodia to happen. The odd thing is under Trump, it's been really consistent in terms of, the messaging has been that China's involvement in Cambodia needs to stop, and that has not been let go of. And I hope that with Biden, it won't just be that, it'll be with the support of Japan and with the support of ASEAN and other members in turning a different outcome for Cambodia, along with, of course, a messaging that has some credibility when it comes to democracy, which is that, democracy promotion isn't simply isn't going to get lip service, but will be an actual thing that America returns to with credibility and gusto.
Thank you, Dr. Sopal. I think this question about Biden is cuts across the region. I think we're wondering what the Biden administration would be like across Southeast Asia. Would it be more like Obama, or would it be a rejection of Trump, or would it be its own kind of Biden administration combining both? On Myanmar, Tan, in addition to the question from the former Foreign Minister, there's also a question from social media, from Facebook, and this is something, is very common, but it needs to be addressed. Why has Aung San Suu Kyi been silent on the Rohingya issue?
Yeah, thank you for both those sort of related questions in a way. I think, with the election, the NLD party several months ago had refused to enter into any kind of alliance with ethnic minority parties. But since its victory, its overwhelming victory, including in many ethnic minority areas, there has been some kind of reach out suggesting the possibility of some sort of cooperation in terms of forming the next government. So some people are cynical, some people are skeptical, but there, at least over these few weeks, we'll have to see if there is the possibility of some kind of discussion between the NLD party and ethnic minority parties, which might include ethnic minority people from outside the NLD being appointed to positions in the central government or in the regions, and that could in turn be seen as an initial kind of step that would lead to some sort of momentum for not just the peace process, but kind of broader issues around reconciliation in general. But at a broader level, I would have to say that between the army and the NLD, I don't think there's actually that much difference on key issues around national identity. I think there is a sort of an emerging Burmese-speaking Buddhist middle-class consensus around what ethnicity and national identity means, which essentially excludes the Muslim Rohingya people. You see, actually, you have the language from the early 1990s, late 1980s, 1990s, which really enshrine this idea of indigeneity, of indigenous peoples of the country, and Myanmar being a union of those indigenous people, as opposed to people who are alien or guests of the country. And in that divide, the people along the Bangladesh border, the Rohingya people in particular, through initially the expulsion of many of these people in late 1970s and then early 1990s and then again in 2016, 2017, were really at the margins and really fell outside that imagination of who belonged to the country and who didn't. And I think on that central concept, I don't think there's that much difference between the average army officer who's 40 years old and the average NLD supporter or party member who's 40 years old. I think there's an emerging kind of consensus around that concept, which perhaps could help in some way in terms of relationships between the ethnic Burmese majority and minority groups like the Shan or Kachins or others. But unfortunately, I think for the Rohingya issue, I think it's going to become, or it's going to further entrench these kinds of problems and challenges that we see. So I don't think it's so much a question of whether this electoral victory will give Aung San Suu Kyi the strength to address these issues, because there are many things that could be done that are well within the gift of the civilian side of the government. So it's really an issue of policy, state capacity in general to some extent, and behind that, a degree of political instinct and ideology as well.
Okay, thank you. Professor Winrat, in terms of civil-military relations, the role of the military in politics is very assertive and ascendant now. How do we reverse that? 20, 30 years ago, it was the other way.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Thank you very much, Tan Kasit. A tough question, and I think the only way that we can see physically that to get rid of the role of the military or weakening the role of the military is having capitals that against the military power, or having manpower like millions of people on the street, which is very unlikely because, the capitals and the military now is in, allied and very close allied, and they are both happy together, especially the monopoly capital as well as the Chinese investment capital. So this is very tough, for the physical force to go against military. And I think most people are aware. But another one is the role of military is very important in Thailand because it protects the national identity, the dominant national identity, the old dominant national identity, or monarchy. So when people started to question the role of the monarchy, people started to finding alternative national ideology. I think that is the beginning of questioning the military, and in the long term, probably we're gonna have a stronger question against the military, not only for young generation but for all generations. But still, as an institutionalist and political scientist, I still think we have to build political institutions to strengthen the democratic institutions. When the democratic institutions function well, we do not need military in the politics, meaning we have a strong executive, strong parliament, or even independent agencies. But right now we have very weak, so if, I would like to ask elites out there who have potential to really strengthen one of these institutions, they should start doing now to do it. But for younger generation and for people at grassroots, I think you should cling on your linkage with the party, linkage with your politician, no matter what kind of linkage. But it would be better to be like more programmatic or democratic linkage. But yeah, cling on that.
Unlike Myanmar, and maybe you can give us some background on this, Thant. In Thailand, the military never goes back to the barracks without a fight. There has to be some kind of a crisis, confrontation. 1992 was a major one. 1973, big student uprising. Still did not leave until the numbers really grew, until there was some violence in the streets and the military lost legitimacy. The dictatorship then went abroad. And in 1991, 1992, after the coup, some bloodshed, and then they went back to the barracks. That was, I think, the mid-1990s, the Thai military, especially the Thai army, felt disgraced for what happened in 1992, for the bloodshed. Since then, in the late 1990s, we had security sector reforms looking at civilian control of the military. A lot of progress. And in 2000s, the military became repoliticized, if you will. And then this trend just built. And now, basically, in 2014, they took complete control. And there's no doubt. And then in order to secure and ensure their control, they write a new constitution, more or less. And this guarantees a indefinite military influence, military supervision. And even though the younger generations are rising up, it's very daunting. I don't know how, the conservative royalist side, very entrenched and closing ranks. And they have the law, they have the physical force of arms. So I don't know how the students going to win. I mean, it would be very difficult. And you look at the streets, the numbers are not that great. But if you look at the social media, 7 digits, people have grievances. So I think there's a long road ahead. I don't think it will be resolved or in the next months. It might take some months, maybe a few years, maybe even more. But I tend to think that on the one side, the incumbent regime seems untenable to me, right? I mean, they have to make some changes or some adjustments. Otherwise, this gap is going to widen and tensions will rise and there'll be some confrontation. In Myanmar, when Thein Sein came in, General Thein Sein, he became a reformer. I mean, that period was remarkable. How can you have an entrenched, almost 50 years of military dictatorship, giving way, sharing power, allowing elections with constitution, and that one man, I mean, I don't know what's up with him now, but General Thein Sein was a key catalyst, change agent. Now, we don't have anyone like that in the Thai military that we can see, but maybe that will emerge, who knows. But how did that emerge then?
Yeah, I think, let me say one other point just before, and then to address your point. Because if we think of these three countries, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, the one word we've never mentioned, or the one thing we haven't talked about, is Buddhism. And we talk about identity, we talk about ideology, but of course these are the three, together with Sri Lanka and Laos, the three of the five Theravada Buddhist countries in the world. And at least in Myanmar, I don't know how Thailand has changed the last 20, 30 years, but it's still a deeply, deeply conservative Buddhist country in many ways. And in the same way that I don't think we could analyze or talk about medieval Europe without thinking about the church and Christianity, we can't really talk about Myanmar without thinking of Buddhism, which is such an influence on the way people think about their own lives, what they want, their future life and everything else, and the role of the Sangha and Buddhist monks as well. I just throw that out as an issue that we don't talk about generally, and is certainly not part of Western kind of discourse about these countries often. But I think in the Burma case or the Myanmar case is an enormous influence in terms of how people think. And it's even an enormous influence, I think, in terms of how military people and generals think. I mean, it's not just an ideology that's out there, it's something people really believe. And so I think when some generals retire and they actually spend a lot of the rest of their life in terms of Buddhist meditation or religious practice, this is not just sort of made up, it's actually part of what's actually important to them. I think in the Myanmar case, what we have to recognize is that the army took over in 58, then held elections and gave up power. They took over in 62, tried to create a socialist constitution and a party that failed in terms of its economic policies. It led to fiscal crisis in 1987, 1988. Then it set up this junta, which in the 90s tried to set up this mixed constitution. They were pushed back. Aung San Suu Kyi's democracy movement, backed by the West, the US, the UK, and others, seemed to be this revolutionary challenge. And then in 2010, when they finally moved ahead with their constitution anyway, they thought that the USDP, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, headed by ex-generals, could be a kind of permanent, if not proxy, then a kind of allied political party. But we've seen over the last 10 years that's kind of fallen apart through internal fights and everything else, and they did extremely poorly in this last election. But it was really General Than Shwe who was the dictator and whose regime was guilty of all kinds of human rights abuses, which actually set the stage for then what came. What General Thein Sein did was he went far beyond what was intended in terms of political liberalization. And I think the reason he did that, and some of his own ministers and other ex-generals did that, were for a whole variety of different personal reasons. They came from different backgrounds, had different motivations. And my book, which maybe some of you might read, The Hidden History of Burma, really explores, it's based to some extent on interviews with many dozens of these people who are in the government and generals and ex-generals, and so explores to some extent the reasons why this specifically happened. But let me end by just saying that, I think a strange thing might happen now, which is that the army, having looked for different political fronts with which to work, may actually find in the NLD the party they've always been looking for. Because, in the 1990s, the NLD was seen as a threatening revolutionary movement, but it settled into something very different. And the NLD, when it first appeared, was a very broad church that included ex-communists, that included trade unionists, that included ex-military people. And over 20 years, 90s and 2000s, many of those left-wing figures died or were jailed. The left of the party kind of was decimated. And what really remained at a core were many ex-military officers who had allied with Aung San Suu Kyi. I think many of them genuinely wanted democracy in a kind of liberal democracy sense, but they were also conservative. And in that way, the NLD has emerged over these last 10 years as a kind of a center-right party, based around part of the rising middle class that's religious, that's Buddhist, that's kind of pro-business, that has these conservative values. And that's, again, not so different from what many people in the army want as well. So it's not impossible that, other than this kind of current tension that's there between the commander-in-chief and Aung San Suu Kyi, that in some ways there's a new establishment emerges, for better or for worse, that exists in this kind of center-left kind of dimension of politics.
That would be remarkable kind of convergence or fusion even. But would that be up to the standards of the international community?
I think that the more kind of the bigger question in a way is, will it actually lead to change in general, in other ways, right? Because you could imagine a kind of a center-right establishment that's based on the Burmese majority that really is incapable for many different reasons, maybe inherent to their own worldview, of making, of creating a more inclusive national identity, of doing, seeing through the kind of outreach to ethnic minority communities, because at the core of their conservative values will also be a kind of ethno-nationalist vision of their society and a very hierarchical vision of their society. I mean, and I think in all of our countries, in a way, democracy is one thing, but the societies themselves can be also very undemocratic. So what you have when you have elections over an undemocratic society, it produces a certain outcome that may not be democratic in a certain way, even if the elections are technically fine in many others. But I think that, you know, and then there's the question of, you know, can this establishment then really confront Myanmar's chronic underdevelopment? And there I would just like to say that, you know, I think Myanmar is facing kind of three choices, and it's at a crossroads in this way. I mean, one is that this new establishment could seek to mobilize domestic capital and seek accommodation with the Myanmar business class, which includes the people that are sort of seen as the crony class in Myanmar. And that could be then part of a new elite establishment that goes forward. Or it could see that crony class as an enemy, as a remnant of the old military regime, and basically open the door even more widely to foreign investment and seek an alliance with global capital to move the economy forward. Or it could seek an alliance with Chinese capital, where there's a lot of money and opportunities that could emerge very quickly. Or it could be a mix of these three things. And I think where it finds itself in that mix is actually going to say a lot about how the country changes over the coming 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Thant. You know, one thing that we're not seeing in Cambodia and Thailand is kind of a enlightened self-interest. So when the incumbent regime, the Tatmadaw, the military, the SPDC had full power, right? They at that time, out of enlightened self-interest, if I may say, I mean, they allowed for reforms, they made adjustment, they shared some power, they allowed for a new constitution, eventually elections, the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi, out of house arrest and so on, and you know, from there to now, some progress. In Cambodia and Thailand, the incumbent regime, not seeing these self-interests, to make some adjustments, some concessions, while they have, you know, full control. And when they don't do that, when they have full control, they may be forced to make concessions and reforms when they have less control or no control. And that could be turmoil, could be very unstable. So do you see, Dr. Sopao, in Cambodia, any sign or chance of reform and adjustments and concessions and accommodation? We've seen this before in the past. Hun Sen did allow the opposition back, and then you know, they actually had seats in parliament, 55 seats I think at that time. But now he's gone all the way. Would he have any self-interest to come back the other way? Perhaps because of Western sanctions and so on?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's been there was historically a pattern of sort of, it's like a cat and mouse game where essentially Hun Sen would chase the opposition, and the opposition leader would leave the country and then eventually be allowed to return. And this was a recurring pattern, one that broke after 2017, where essentially Hun Sen made the decision, whether from the standpoint of believing that there was no other option, but to essentially say, you know, we're not going to repeat the past. And in fact, in the period before he did that, there was something called the culture of dialogue, where Sam Rainsy, and then opposition leader, and Hun Sen even had dinners together, families having dinners together, and becoming very close, in fact, causing some consternation among other opposition party members, believing that Sam Rainsy was being co-opted into Hun Sen's sphere of influence. At this point, one would have to see whether, you know, there is any kind of hope to allow Sam Rangsi, Musa Kua, Kem Sokha, and of course they have their own, Kem Sokha has his faction. He came from the Human Rights Party, and Sam Rangsi came from the Sam Rangsi Party, and they both created the Cambodian National Rescue Party together. But that essentially Hun Sen's approach has been to create this wedge where Kem Sokha has remained in Cambodia, whether under house arrest or a detention of some kind or another, and then the dual nationals, French Cambodian national Sam Rangsi, American Cambodian Musa Kua, were told to essentially exit and stay outside of Cambodia, and you can see the advantage there. He can essentially minimize the disruption from these individuals when they're outside. They can't really, interfere in domestic politics in much in any way. Now that he's also destroyed the independent press, and so that leaves essentially the space for the ruling party to do what it wants in Cambodia. Of course, it brings a lot of negative publicity. Whether there's going to be a change in terms of a future where Hun Sen decides that he's finally going to allow that seems to be, it's an equation that one perpetually calculates, right? So the pressure applied from EBA suspension, GLOMAG sanctions, targeted sanctions, and possibly even GSP now is being talked about as on the table for Cambodia in terms of the U.S. Congress saying, we need to look at, in addition to all this, additional ways in which Cambodia would be pressured to change its way. Whether those things lead to an outcome where Hun Sen says, okay, I'm now going to reopen and allow the opposition back in, seems to be the for Cambodia at least, the multi-billion-dollar question, and it is unknown at this point whether any kind of pressure of that sort, economic, won't be in fact compensated by China, where China says, okay, well, you've been hurt this much, we're going to increase our investment, we're going to increase the amount of money you get, so that you can live another day and continue onwards in your trajectory of essentially blocking out all outside opposition from returning to Cambodia.
Thank you, Dr. Sopal. Let me bring in a question from Ambassador Helena, and then we'll come to you, Jan Ringrat. Please, Ambassador. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you so much for a hugely interesting
Just please
panel.
tell us your name first.
Yes, yeah. I'm Helena Dritz. I'm a Swedish diplomat, not currently employed by any mission or organization here in Thailand. But I'd like to introduce the regional perspective. You are all describing increased authoritarian rule, increased nationalist tendencies, weakening of democratic institutions, lack of cooperative processes, and if we add economic crisis and closed borders between the countries, things don't look good for regional cooperation. At the same time, the need for regional cooperation may be greater than ever when this region needs to advance sustainable development, human security for its populations, protect valuable natural resources and the environment, and also perhaps counterbalance greater geopolitical ambitions and influence. So, what prospect for regional cooperation at this time? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take last question if there's any remark. Gwen Robinson, please. Gwen Robinson is a senior fellow at ISIS Thailand.
Oh, thanks for making it a bit easier for me. Yes, and also editor-at-large at Nikkei Asia. Thanks for a lot of very interesting ideas, and I think actually, Lena, touched on a lot of what I was going to say about regional cooperation, and I think that is interesting, and we haven't mentioned ASEAN very much at all, and as we know, it's got a long tradition of not interfering in each other's affairs, but has been more active in recent years. But I'd also like to hark to that theme of foreign relations that is in the title of the seminar, and we've heard a lot of interesting things about, for example, China, obviously, and also this idea about Japan as a potentially playing more of a role. It's very interesting in all three countries, Japan's role, particularly now here in Thailand. It's unprecedented that Japan's in the spotlight for harbouring one of the anti-monarchy fugitives, which has put Japan in a very odd situation as one of the biggest investors in Thailand. I just wondered if, from what all of you have been saying about external powers, particularly US and EU, where we've seen a lot of disillusionment in the region, the EU with its sanctions on Cambodia and now in disarray itself over Brexit, Britain saying it wants to be more involved in the region but completely incapacitated by local domestic politics, and also the US with its huge problems we've seen this year combined with COVID, and we've got Japan in the background with a good profile in all three countries, and ASEAN lurking around trying to increase regional cooperation. But do any of you see a huge shift generally in the attitude about external power involvement? Because the region is very vulnerable post-COVID, it needs more investment and has to look externally, so it needs more relationships with these big powers that have disappointed people. On the other hand, there's a lot of focus now on the domestic internal dynamics.
Okay, thank you very much, Gwen. So perhaps local, regional, and international, regional cooperation, international involvement. So I'll come to you, Professor Wingrat. First on the Thailand, the role of the international community, is it important at all? I mean, these days in Thailand, in Thai politics, to what extent do they have a role? And on the regional, I'll just say that there's been a lot of frustration within ASEAN. There's even a suggestion by a retired diplomat in an ASEAN country that ASEAN doesn't always have to be 10 countries deciding that perhaps Cambodia and Laos can be excluded, even kicked out. That was really quite a comment, and it's led to some heated exchange of words between the two capitals. But nevertheless, there's a lot of frustration with ASEAN, lack of regional cooperation, and ASEAN is even maybe backsliding together towards authoritarianism. And the role of the international community, to what extent, Professor Wingrat?
Okay, thank you, Ajahn Thitinan. Yeah, according to my own observation, I don't see much of whether the elites care much about the foreign pressure. But obviously, the election last year was due to EU's ban on Thai export, and also a lot of foreign media put pressure on Thai government, and that's probably account for a bit of reform. But they, regardless of all these pressures, they still decide a system that embed themselves inside the system, and it's very difficult to develop into full democracy. And I think for this moment, when a very small country like Thailand has been watched around the world, especially in Japan's media, in Japanese media, in Australian media, as well as in the US media, I think the government have to really watch out for that. More importantly, the German factor that started to question on the residency of our king in Germany. That would be another step that probably would bring about a change, hopefully. But as I mentioned a lot about this dominant ideology that placed the king as the top of this ideology, the thing we see in Thailand is very mysterious. So we can't really foresee the future. If you ask 3 years, 5 years, or just few days, it might happen in few days because it's so mysterious that important factors in Thailand is very mysterious. And then I would like to come back to whether we see the light at the end of the tunnel in Thai in a way out to better political and economic situation. Many people hoped that at the end of the pandemic or at the late peak time of the pandemic, Thailand would be failed to, manage the pandemic, and that would lead to the failure of the government. Fortunately, the government could successfully maintain this pandemic, prevention of the pandemic very well, together with, thanks to the Ministry of Public Health that allow local networks to function very well. So this is, again, so we could only see, we keep hoping that the black box inside, the old institutions would be cracked, or military itself would be, having some conflicts inside, so that only the light in the tunnel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now it seems that the international pressure is increasing, it's intensifying, but it also appears that the incumbent regime is willing to pay a higher price and prevail at any cost. So it's just a matter of the cost being higher. You can have more international pressure, but they're willing to put up with in order to prevail and stay and maintain power. I'll just come, Dr. Sopao, just for 1 minute or two from you out there in California. The regional, international, ASEAN, Cambodia, of course. I have to be honest with you. A lot of the ASEAN think tanks and so on not happy at all with the Cambodian alliance, clientelism with China, and then also the role of the international actors, international community. Can they play a decisive role in any way, Cambodian politics? Dr. Sopao.
Right, and look, the former Singapore, I'll just name it, permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who made that suggestion of kicking out Cambodia and Laos, did cause quite a kerfuffle. I mean, it seems to keep happening. It seems to symbolize a lot of the frustration that ASEAN member countries have. Now, when I was asked about it from the press, I had to look up, does ASEAN have an Article 50 equivalent where you can exit? Turns out there doesn't appear to be a way of actually exiting. You just stop attending meetings. Now, of course, that's if you don't want to be part of ASEAN anymore. If somebody else doesn't want you to be part of ASEAN, how can they vote to do that when you have to also vote in it? And if consensus is a requirement, then it would seem to be impossible under this process to essentially be excluded if you object constantly to being excluded. Therefore, the outcome wouldn't arrive. But I think that the kinds of statements that are made about Cambodia being too close to China probably represent some kind of pressure on the elites in Phnom Penh towards reconsidering their position, but it's not going to change it. It might modulate their tone. It might maybe make them deny a little bit more of what's happening, although, of course, satellite images of bases and destroyed buildings do tend to tell the truth about what's happening on location. That's really undeniable. In terms of international pressure, I returned to Japan as a possibility when I said that Japan is seen as this country that is trustworthy in the region. It's really exemplified in the fact that when Japan says it's going to invest in a certain project, it's going to do something, in all likelihood it's going to happen. There's really not much of a doubt that it's going to happen, versus say a Chinese project that might be declared or announced in the press, and then a year later nothing's happening, 2 years later nothing's happening, it's disappeared. And so the value of one's word as a country, as an investor, certainly for Japan has a heavier weight in the sense of, yeah, okay, well, perhaps one should listen when Japan does object. Now, whether Japan does say anything or doesn't say anything, it's been a pattern of Japan's in Cambodia to not really, object too loudly, to use quiet diplomacy in that way. But perhaps when it does matter in situations like, the destruction of democracy, the, abuse of human rights, the curtailing of freedom, it would make a difference to see Japan step up, and perhaps, that can make that difference.
Thank you, Dr. Sopal. In a minute or two that remains, Thant, maybe, so Aung San Suu Kyi is a fallen icon in a way, but the country keeps moving in its own way, Myanmar. What do you see, going forward? I mean, the role of the regional role of ASEAN, very limited, but the international role, has it been, to what extent has it been consequential? And to what extent we'll see more of it going forward?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be, I know we're almost out of time. I mean, just to say that I think in the Myanmar case, it's not impossible that a certain type of pressure on certain things might produce results. But in general, I think the idea that outside pressure would fundamentally change Myanmar's political direction in one way or another on big issues like the Rohingya crisis, I think is almost impossible. I mean, this is a country, or Myanmar is a country which in the 2000s, at the height of the George Bush wars, when there was invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, still refused to kind of change its basic political course under enormous pressure from the United States as well as from the Europeans and others. So I don't think it's going to happen now. I think in terms of regional cooperation, I would say that one thing, I mean, this is a general point, not just on Myanmar, but if there's one region in the world that really needs to cooperate on climate change, it should be Southeast Asia, and yet I see very little from ASEAN on climate change. Secondly, I think in terms of, ASEAN has been speaking a lot about economic integration over a generation, and that's fine when the going is good, but now, with the pandemic and the global economic downturn, where many countries and places like the United States on both the left and the right are talking about industrial policy, about reshoring industries, about, allying global supply chains to political considerations. I mean, what is that ASEAN vision then going forward in terms of what kinds of industrial policies ASEAN countries should have? And also what we've seen during the pandemic is that ASEAN has done very little in terms of protecting the most vulnerable. So when the going is good again, it's fine in terms of promoting markets and integration, but when you have a downturn, vulnerable people, especially migrant workers in different countries, really receive no protection, least of all from ASEAN as a regional institution. I think in the Myanmar case specifically, in 2017 when we had the Rohingya crisis and we had this huge falling out with Western countries, which has to some extent remained, I think Myanmar felt it was facing this choice, right? One is it could either try to cooperate or compromise and climb this enormous hill of compromise with Western countries without really being sure what was on the other side. It could run into a China embrace, which was then there to be had. And instead, I think Myanmar tried very hard to carve out a third option of much deeper relations, economic relations with Japan, Korea, and other countries in the region. And so at the end of the day, I think what happens next, politics often follows economics. What happens next depends on also where the money and the investment is going to come from. And as Gwen Robinson sort of indicated, I mean, Japan is the one country that has been able to kind of flex its economic muscle in Myanmar and show that it could be an alternative to Chinese investment. And whether or not Myanmar uses that in a clever way and uses the possibility of these different options around its own industrial policy and modernization development policy, I think is a critical question going forward.
Thank you very much, Thant. In relative terms, Myanmar should be the laggard here among the three countries because of the racial tensions, religious issues, race, religion, Buddhism, Islam, and then you don't have that in Cambodia and Thailand. It's not an ethnic hatred, it's not an ethnic conflict. This political conflict in Thailand and Cambodia, race and religion are not involved. So in fact, I mean, to me, Cambodia and Thailand should be doing a lot better in terms of progress towards democratization, and Myanmar has done much better than the other two. So please join me in thanking Dr. Sopal. Thank you very much, seeing you virtually from your home in California. Thank you very much, and good to be working with you again. Thank you very much for making the time. Professor Rinat, thank you very much for being with us today, and Dr. Tan Min Du, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today. Thank you, and thank you to all of you.